Well, first, thanks to everyone for inviting us. Thanks to Jen for inviting us to speak to everyone. We're really excited to be here. And I have a special surprise for everyone. Today, his very first day, our new Managing Director of Government Relations, Dr. Felton Moss, here at NSBA. So, as I said, it's his first day. So we have him in 100 meetings, maybe not 100, but quite a few meetings. But he is very kind to stop into this meeting just for a few minutes, just to talk to you for just a minute, and then we have him in some other things. So I wanted to turn it over real quick to Dr. Felton Moss to just say hello and tell you just a little bit about himself. Go ahead, Dr. Moss.
Hello everyone. I'm Felton Moss, excited to be here at the National School Board Association. I'm certainly not a stranger to space as I'm an elected school board member as well in Prince George's County, Maryland. I care deeply about this work and advancing the work of our school boards. I have spent lots of time doing education policy, from working on Capitol Hill to working at a state Department of Ed. I'm also a professor of education policy. So I've studied this work, and prior to that, I was a teacher and middle school principal and high school assistant principal. And I'm just glad to be working with each of you doing this work. And Jason, I appreciate you introducing me today, and I can't wait to meet all of you in person or in other virtual settings. But good to be here, and thank you for giving me the space to introduce myself, Jason.
Yeah, you bet, Dr. Moss. And again, we are very excited to have you on board. And I know you're super busy today, so thanks for just taking a minute to say hello to our folks from Michigan. So back to your meetings you go, and I'm sure I'll be connecting with you soon. Okay, so there's a lot that's happening here in Washington, D.C. I want to do a brief review of the last couple months, as well as talk about what we're likely to see over the next week as we approach the end of the fiscal year, and potentially what happens later on this year. So as you know, Congress passed and the president signed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act earlier this year. For Medicaid, that is a big concern for us at NSBA. We were very opposed to these cuts to Medicaid, 1 trillion in Medicaid cuts over 10 years. Obviously, this is a huge concern for school districts because the lack of federal money coming in means that states are probably going to have to either raise revenues or cut benefits as that federal money goes away. So we're watching that very closely. I know in Michigan, you're dealing with your own budget situations at the state level, so this is only going to make it a little more difficult going forward. The other thing to talk about is the cuts to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. This is going to impact the federal state share for SNAP benefits. Basically, the amount of money that the federal government contributes is going to, for administration at least, is going to decrease from 50% down to 25% in fiscal year 2027. Larger states are going to have even larger impact, of course. And the way that this is going to be calculated, it's based on what they call error rates starting in FY 2028. And I'm going to exit just for a second because my notes for this are on a different screen. So bear with me just for a second, and hopefully it won't mess things up. Okay, so in Michigan, what this means is the state's SNAP payment error rate for FY24 was about 9.5%. Under the bill, states with error rates from 8% to 10% must pay 10% of the SNAP benefit costs. So based on FY 2024, Michigan SNAP benefits paid to recipients was over $3 billion. So that would mean a 10% cost share would mean the state would have to contribute about $300 million annually. That's assuming that the error rate does not drop. I think if it gets under 5% in the error rate, the state doesn't have to pay quite as much to the program. So that's something to watch closely there. The other thing I want to talk about is the private school tax that was included, the private school tax credit program that was included in the bill. This won't launch until January 1st of 2027. Donors get a $1,700 federal tax credit for the contributions they make to scholarship granting organizations that are primarily serving private school students. These funds could be used for tuition, tutoring, special education services, and other tech or supplies. Um, in Michigan, as you know, the state constitution has some of the strictest limits in the country on directing public resources toward private education. One of the compromises that Congress made in including this tax credit into the final bill was states have to opt into the program. So they get to choose whether or not they want to have this as an option. Governor Whitmer has not indicated support for opting in. Again, it doesn't start until 2027, so there's still a lot of time remaining, but some states have already moved forward, others have declined. Michigan, I don't think we really know where we are, what you're going to do yet, but as I mentioned, the state constitution does have some of the strictest limits in the country. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. Hopefully this will work. All right. So another thing I want to talk about is the FY25. That's the fiscal year we're currently in that ends in about a week or so. So as you know, in July, the Trump administration held back about 7 billion in state and district grants. These were largely formula grants for Title II, Title IV, Title III, Title 1C, and 21st Century Learning Communities, which is after school. This generated a lot of consternation here in Washington, D.C. There was a huge outcry from certainly education groups such as NSBA, but you also had bipartisan Republican and Democrats were both upset with this funding that was being withheld. I think ultimately you saw about 11 or 12 Republican senators led by Senator Shelley Moore Capito from West Virginia wrote a letter to OMB and the Trump administration, and ultimately that money was released. That does not mean it did not have a significant disruption to schools and school districts, as each of you know. The delay triggered staff layoffs, cuts to summer school programs and teacher training. So obviously a huge disruption over the summer. Summer school programs that were canceled cannot be restarted, obviously, once the school year is underway. Even with the money released, OMB stated that funds were released with safeguards to, quote, prevent use in violation of executive orders or administration policy. This is largely targeting things like DEI, but it also targets providing services to immigrant students. So even though the funding was withheld, I think the action is still seeing implications for schools and school districts around the country. Now I want to turn to FY 2026. So this is the fiscal year that begins on October 1. Back in July, the Senate Appropriations Committee passed by a bipartisan vote of 26-3 a pretty good bill. I think in this current environment, it rejected the proposed White House cut. It provides level funding from the Department of Education. Because of those withheld funds I just talked about, it requires on-time distribution of Title I, IDEA, CTE, adult education, and other funds to prevent what we saw in July. It also prohibits shifting Title I and IDEA out of the education department, and it mandates adequate staffing for the education department. It also provides a lot of funding increases, not large increases, but again, in this political environment, I think it's a really good bill considering. IDA would get 50 million increase, Title I 50 million, rural ed, and then you can see some of the other increases there. Level funding for things like Title II, Title IV-A, English learners, and other things that you can see there. Now, I want to pivot to the House bill. The House bill unlike the Senate, was passed on a partisan vote, 35 to 28. Let me just say from the start, I think it's unlikely to pass the House of Representatives because of the cuts to Title I and other programs. They're extremely drastic. Overall, for education, the House bill would cut education department funding by 15% from FY 2025 levels. That's about $12 billion. It would cut Title I by $5.2 billion. That's 27%. I don't think there's appetite um, in the House of Representatives to pass these cuts. I think some members are going to be very happy with this, but with only two Republican, you can only afford to lose two Republicans in the House of Representatives, and I would be very surprised if essentially all Republicans but two were to support cuts to Title I like this. It also does improve or does provide some funding increases for things like IDEA, CTE, charter schools, and impact aid. But again, I think that it stands very long odds of passing the House. Often what you see is this is kind of a negotiating ploy. So if we get to the point where the House and the Senate are negotiating on what they want to provide for specific programs, the House can say, okay, we'll move from a 27% cut to Title I to a 15% cut to Title I. Again, I don't think the entire House would be on board with that. The Senate certainly would not be, but it's kind of the game that they play. So, as I mentioned, the Senate bill is, we feel, a much better bill considering the political environment that we're in. And NSBA actually launched an advocacy alert last week at our urban school board conference in LA. So, if you would like to urge Congress to support the Senate Appropriations Committee's bill that we just talked about, that provides increases for things like Title I and IDEA, and protections for keeping IDA and Title I within the department, ensuring adequate staffing and things like that, and also rejecting the House Appropriation Committee's bill, which makes significant cuts to education funding. You can text the word Senate, SENATE, to 52886. You can point to your phone's camera to that QR code, or you can visit p2a.co/P825JBF to receive a text message back to yourself that you can click that will allow you to send that message to your members of Congress. Again, I'll share this with Jen later, so if you don't want to take the action now, you can do it at another time, but we would really urge you to weigh in on this because the two bills are dramatically different and have tremendous impacts on schools.
And Jason, if I can jump in real
Yes.
quick, that link is in Friday's News from the Capitol. There's an update about the federal budget, and there's a link to NSBA's alert in that. So if you have that, you have the link already.
Thank you, Jen. Okay. Some other things I want to talk about before we get to FY 2026. This is just recapping things that have happened over the summer. First, as you may know, there was a constitutional challenge to the Universal Services Fund, which provides funding for E-rate, rural broadband, and other universal services programs. Thankfully, the Supreme Court affirmed the constitutionality of the program, so we see that as a big win. This removes some of the legal uncertainty that threatens school and library connectivity. The FCC and Congress is now kind of focused on long-term USF reform, but for the current for now, we are kind of where we have been with E-rate, with rural broadband and other universal service programs, which is a good thing. Something that the FCC launched earlier this year was a $200 million cybersecurity pilot over 3 years. More than 700 schools, libraries, and other consortia were selected for this program in 2025. The demand for this program was incredible. Even though it was only a $200 million program, I think they had close to over $1 trillion in applications. So hopefully the FCC, with the change in leadership, with it now being led by a Republican, they're looking at some of the programs that where E-rate had funded before. I hope that the demand they're seeing for the cybersecurity program means that they will continue the pilot as well as potentially expanding it given the demand. Um, One thing we have heard from the new FCC chair, Brendan Carr, is he's proposed overturning the 2023 decision to fund Wi-Fi on school buses. He's also asked the FCC to essentially get rid of the Wi-Fi hotspots that libraries and schools were using or were allowing students to use, where you could take home a Wi-Fi hotspot to connect to the internet. I grew up in a really rural area. I know you folks are from rural Michigan, so I see this as a really important decision. So it will be close. It'll be important to watch the FCC and see what they ultimately decide to do. The FCC currently has two Republicans and one Democrat, and it'll kind of stay that way as long as you have a Republican in the White House. So they haven't announced when they might consider rolling back this decision. So it's something that we're watching closely on the FCC calendar, and we'll certainly keep you informed when we learn more. Now, kind of the big news on everyone's radar is the upcoming end of the FY26 fiscal year and the start of the FY 2026 fiscal year. So really three possibilities that could come from our current situation. Government shutdown, which I don't think anyone wants. A short-term continuing resolution, which could kick the can down the road and give Congress more time to negotiate, or a final appropriations package. I think that would be the best situation for education and schools. It's also the one that's going to take the most work to get to. So let me walk you through these three possibilities. So the short-term continuing resolution, this would extend current funding to sometime in the fall. The House passed a bill that I believe extends funding until October 18th or something like that. The Senate voted against the bill. They need to get 60 votes, which means you need about 7 Democrats to go along with Republicans. In the Senate vote, 1 Democrat voted for it, 2 Republicans voted against it. So we're kind of in this stalemate here where both the House and the Senate have already adjourned. The House isn't going to return, I think, until October 1st or 2nd. So that would be after the shutdown would take effect if the Senate does not act. Senate Majority Leader John Thune of Texas has essentially said Democrats can either take it or leave it, it being the House passed CR or we're going to shut down. So Democrats are trying to get some changes around Obamacare and some other priorities included in the CR. Republicans want to do what's called a clean CR that really doesn't have any additional provisions to it, although they did attach additional money for protection for federal lawmakers, Democrats and Republicans alike. So right now we're at a stalemate. Senator Schumer, who is the minority leader in the Senate from New York, has asked for a meeting with President Trump. President Trump has said, absolutely, I'll meet with you whenever. That's kind of where we are. We are about, 8 days from the deadline, the midnight deadline on September 30th. So right now we're just kind of watching and waiting to see what may happen. There are other possibilities that have been discussed as well. I think Democrats would like to have a continuing resolution that goes closer to Thanksgiving that would give them a little bit more time to negotiate. But again, we're just going to have to wait and see what happens there. The other thing that could happen is a final appropriations package. I would note that we're currently, the FY25, the government is currently funded by a CR. So that means pretty much everything, including the Department of Defense, was level funded from 2024 to fiscal 2025. This is the first time in modern history the Department of Defense has been funded under a CR at level funding. Usually they find a way to do some small increases or big increases there. I think that means that a lot of Republicans and others who want to devote more money to defense are really opposed to another CR. Because if they were going to do another CR, that would mean 2 years in a row that the Department of Defense received no increases. So one potential leverage point that Senate Democrats are trying to do is they want to link the labor, health and human services, and education spending bill to the defense bill in hopes that they can get the Senate numbers included. Again, that's a freeze for the Department of Education and some small increases for programs like Title I and IDEA. Link that to some increases in defense spending, and maybe you could get a coalition in the House of Republicans and Democrats voting for a CR or a final appropriations package like that. In past years, Democrats have worked with Republicans to pass a CR. Now, that's a bit more uncertain because of things like rescission packages that have been announced, where the White House has withheld money for things like public broadcasting. They've canceled mental health grants. As I mentioned, they held back some of those programs back in July. So Democrats aren't really ready to trust that the administration will let the money come out the door and go out to grant recipients that Congress itself and the president has signed into law. So they're a little wary of any kind of deal. I want to note something about the Secure Rural Schools reauthorization. This is obviously something very important to rural districts who have been grappling with declining revenues coming in from federal lands and timber sales. This is something that NSBA worked very closely on last year. The Michigan Association signed on to our letter. They were one of probably 13 or 14 of NSBA's state associations that signed on a letter asking Congress to reauthorize the Secure Rural Schools program. We thought that we might get it into the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that passed earlier this year. It actually was included in the Senate, but the House couldn't quite get it across the finish line. Where it stands now, the bill has passed in the House. It has not passed in the Senate. We're really waiting for House Speaker Mike Johnson to put the bill up for a vote. But absent that, NSBA is part of a larger coalition with a lot of education organizations, as well as some rural counties organizations, to try to push for a reauthorization for this program in the next CR. When I say next CR, I mean not the one that they're talking about now, that's really just a clean CR, but the next one. So if they get a CR until the middle of October or closer to Thanksgiving, the one that they may need after that, that's where we're really going to push for more action on secure rural schools. There's a talk of a national organization sign-on letter. I know that the chief sponsors of this legislation, both Republicans, Senator Wyden and Representative LaMalfa from California, are working on a sign-on letter with their co-sponsors that they can send to the speaker in hopes that we can get this bill moving. So I've already talked about a lot of this stuff. This is kind of where we are right now. It's a standoff. The House bill, as I said, would extend funding through November 21. We don't really have a clear path forward. I mentioned the House isn't going to return until after the shutdown would begin. Republicans are saying Democrats have to accept the House passed CR. Democrats want bipartisan negotiations. There are some of the core disputes I mentioned, the health insurance subsidies. Democrats also want to roll back some of the Medicaid cuts that were included in the One Big Beautiful Bill, as well as some of the Trump administration budget maneuvers that I mentioned earlier around rescissions and others. Essentially, there's a lot of political gamesmanship going on. Democrats think that the public would find fault with Republicans for the shutdown. Republicans think that the public would find fault with the Democrats for the shutdown. So there's a lot of messaging on both sides. So I think this might need to play out for another couple of days. Maybe if you get a poll or something that shows one side or the other is going to take a bigger political hit for this, maybe they come to the table. It might take a few days of a shutdown before either side starts to feel some of the pressure and wants to come to the table. Again, no one wants a government shutdown. It impacts everything from, the Smithsonian here in Washington, D.C., as well as, national parks, so many other things. I do want to talk about how it might affect um, not just kind of the economy at large here. As you can see, each week of a shutdown reduces GDP growth by about 0.5 points. Um, Agencies face furloughs potentially. Essential workers would stay on the job. Um, for education, the good news is most education programs would generally be unaffected because they are forward funded. However, Head Start and Impact Aid could face paused payments to grantees. This could mean disruption in services for Head Start, including meals, education, and family support, because Head Start does rely on annual discretionary appropriations. For Impact Aid, could mean the same thing. Payments to local school districts could be delayed, affecting district cash flow. Bigger programs like Title I IDEA and other kind of formula-based programs would not necessarily be impacted, or they would not really be impacted unless you had a shutdown that was really prolonged. So for now, at least for those big programs, I don't think it's something that we're going to see an impact, but obviously things like Head Start and Impact Aid could see an impact very quickly. And things like that are what get lawmakers' attention. So I would say if we do end up in a shutdown, if you do see Head Start money um, paused, if you see Aid money delayed, contact your member of Congress, let them know that the shutdown is already impacting the services that you provide to students. That helps them go back to the leadership and say, look, this is really impacting our folks. Let's get this thing moving. The other thing it does is delays payments to members of the military, congressional staff. Those monies are eventually made up when something is enacted, but it doesn't take long for a government shutdown to really start causing disruption a lot of times that people don't really realize until it starts happening. So that's the end of my presentation. I want to turn it over to you. I want to hear from you about your questions. I really appreciate your time and I appreciate the work that you're doing on the ground there in Michigan. So happy to take any questions that people have.
Does anyone have questions for Jason? No? You must have been really thorough.
I hope so. Really, no questions at all? The first one's always the hardest. Jen, any questions from you? Anything I didn't cover that you wanted me to cover?
No, I think you covered what I was looking for. Actually, I do have one question. School nutrition. When we closed down last time, we were told that the school nutrition payments could be affected as well. Is that something that could be affected in a federal shutdown?
That's a good question. I didn't look into that specifically.
It's because I forgot to ask you when we did the prep.
Yeah, probably. I'm gonna have to go back and look at that. I know with things like, school meals, typically, there's money that districts can move around. Obviously, anything that's supposed to be funded by the federal government that isn't, whether it's unless it's canceled, the money would be made up after the fact. So let me look into that just to double check, and I'll get an answer back to you.
And just in your experience, have you ever heard of a state and the federal government both shutting down on the same day?
I often like to say, when you hear these weird odds about things, like my mom, she's like, I've got this thing, and the doctor says it never happens. It's like a 1 in a million shot. She's like, why can't I get the 1 in a million shot where you win the lottery? Um, I have not seen anything like you're facing in Michigan. It's kind of a double jeopardy situation. Jen, you and I certainly talked about that a little bit last week. I don't know. I don't know what to tell you there. That's just, I know your governor's been away. Now that she's back, hopefully that can restart some negotiation there. As I mentioned, once a government shut down, you see a lot of unintended consequences. I remember the last time there was a longer extended shutdown. The thing that got things moving is a lot of constituents were coming to Washington, D.C. to go to the Smithsonian. and it was hot, and it was closed. So instead of going to the Smithsonian, they walked down the street about 5 or 6 blocks to their constituents and said, "What's going on?" So I wish you luck in Michigan. I have not heard of that happening before. I hope that everyone can get that worked out. Hopefully, um, we don't end up with a situation where both the state and the federal government is shut down at the same time. That would be really unfortunate.
Michigan likes to be unique. Last chance, any questions for Jason? All right, well, thank you so much for doing this. We appreciate it. His slides.
I'd love to know if we have extra time. I'd love to know if anyone wants to just share. Like the thing I really love about these groups, and I'm sorry I'm not there in person. I'd love to just know a little bit more about, the challenges you're seeing in your districts. The school year has been underway for a few weeks now. Anything new that you're confronting that you haven't had experience doing, or a new challenge you're seeing? I'd love to hear any stories that people would be willing to share. If not, that's okay.
There has to be someone. Give him a picture of what we deal with in rural Michigan.
I'm Brian Giacosine from Nice Community Schools. I thought you can see me over here in the corner.
Can you hear him?
I can't. I heard community school over in the corner.
Oh, Nice Community Schools. Yeah, we're just a
Okay.
K-12 public school. The funny thing is, can you still hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, this is my 32nd year as a professional educator, and I just feel like we're often in this same boat. It's a little worse right now, I guess, just because of the potentially looming shutdown. But I think we saw a slide earlier that the government shut down for a few minutes, at least in Michigan, back in 2007, 2009. I do sort of chuckle at the certainty with which our legislators on both sides of the aisle say things that are factually incorrect, but they are convinced that they are actually right. We had an example today when one of our representatives said there hasn't been a split government in Michigan since 1995. That's not true. It was split from 2007 through 2010, the Senate and the House. And I don't know how to bridge those gaps other than just asking people to be careful who they vote for, because we give the government what we deserve, I think. Sorry for the pessimism. I'm a disgruntled American besides being a superintendent.
Yeah. Appreciate you speaking up and sharing that. I'll just say, legislators tend to try to be responsive when constituents reach out, certainly on the federal level. And I would say, I mentioned that Congress has recessed until next month. Take an opportunity if you have a chance. A lot of our House of Representatives members do congressional district visits when they're on back in the districts. That's the time to really build the relationship with your federal person when they're in the district, because when they're in Washington, D.C., they're getting calls from, national groups and lobbyists and other folks. So if you can build that relationship when you're in the district, and then when you're coming into DC, they're like, "Oh yeah, I remember we spoke at that open house I had, or the open meeting, or town hall, or whatever." So use this opportunity to try and build some of those relationships, even with the congressional district staff. I worked on Capitol Hill for 3 years. We had 5 district offices, and those district staff were really great about saying, "Hey, we got X number of phone calls or X number of emails today about this issue." My boss would always want a daily report. How many calls and emails did we get about, these 10 issues that were kind of the hot topics of the day? So use this as an opportunity to, share your stories, talk about the impact you're seeing. I think when we had the government held the money back in July, the after school or the summer learning programs that were being canceled. Those stories got back to lawmakers really quickly, and they acted really quickly. And thankfully, the money was eventually released. So stories work. Invite your member to come visit your schools. It's a great photo op for them. And it's a great way for you to say, "Hey, that Title I money really helped us, with this reading program," or, something like that. Try to draw the connection with what they're seeing in your schools to the federal program that funds them. they'll remember that when it comes time to negotiate on appropriations bills. So.
Anyone else? All right. Well, thank you very much, Jason. We really appreciate it. Someday we'll fly you out here to the UP. You can check it out yourself.
Well, or Dr. Moss, or Dr. Moss. One of
Or
us
not,
would
right.
love to be there. But yeah, again, just thank you for the work that you're doing. I know these times are tough, but I'm a parent. I have 3 kids in public schools and elementary, middle, and high school, and just so appreciate the work that you're doing. I know it's hard. I know it's thankless. So I want to be thankful to each of you for the work that you're doing. We'll certainly do everything we can for you here in Washington, D.C., and just really appreciate the time to be with you today and enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you, Jason. Talk to you soon.
Okay. Bye-bye.